everyone, and welcome to the final session of our day. I am thrilled to be here for the Future of Biotech Treatment panel. You're in for a real treat. We may have saved the best for last, although we've had some pretty incredible speakers with us today. I am personally just so excited about this as a 3-time autoimmune patient myself. My name's Lily Stairs, by the way, and I am the vice chair of the board of directors of the Autoimmune Association and have been working with the team to plan this summit. And Dr. Barbara Fox and Dr. David Chernoff are really leaders in autoimmunity, and their companies are creating some amazing innovations and possible new treatments for those of us living with autoimmune conditions. And so today we're gonna chat with them about what they're working on and how it works. And I think you all are going to be so excited about what the future holds for those of us living with autoimmune conditions. And so I'd like to jump right in and start with Dr. Barbara Fox, who is the CEO of Rios Medicines. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what Rios does. But first, I'd like to give you the chance to introduce yourself, Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Lily. It is such an honor and privilege to be here. Really appreciate the opportunity to come in and share a little bit about what we're doing and support the amazing work that this organization is doing. So I'm a scientist by training, started out in chemistry and then moved pretty quickly into immunologist, and have really considered myself an immunologist ever since. Started out in academia, was a professor at University of Maryland in rheumatology, but pretty quickly shifted into biotech, and have been in the biotech industry now for about 30 years. And that, I learned that what really motivated me was that ability to take basic science, because I'm still very driven by the science, and to turn it into things that can have a direct impact on patients. And some of that comes from a personal experience, having I'm not a patient myself, but my older sister had Crohn's disease, had pediatric Crohn's when she was diagnosed when I was very little, and had Crohn's and psoriasis and vitiligo. And gave me kind of that visceral sense as a kid of what it's like to live with a disease that's painful and embarrassing and poorly understood and with a really uncertain prognosis. And she ended up dying from complications of Crohn's, small bowel adenocarcinoma, when she was still in her 40s. And this was just about the time the first anti-TNF was approved. So prior to that, there was just nothing. I mean, there was really nothing but steroids out there for Crohn's. And it gives you that realization. Of course, the field needs all sorts of things, but a safe and effective medication can just be so extraordinarily transformative for patients' lives. So it's sort of in her memory and her kind of commitment to her that sort of keeps me going and gets me up every day to go to work. So I've been in biotech for about 30 years, bunch of different companies, started up a number of companies, some more successfully than others, either in autoimmunity and IBD and immuno-oncology. My last company was bought by Merck. It was in oncology, and I've been with Rios for about 2 years.
Thanks, Dr. Fox, and thank you for sharing your personal experience. I found that a lot of folks who are working in biotech and pharma and innovating on our behalf, they have their personal connection, and that is truly what drives them. And that makes me feel really good that people are being driven by other humans, because I think that's when we do our best work.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, so now let's talk a little bit about Rios. So Rios Medicines is a biopharmaceutical company developing novel medicines to treat autoimmune and inflammatory diseases with greater precision by targeting the metabolic hubs of the immune system. Now, that's a lot of words, and I want to take a moment to really break down what exactly does that mean. And so let's start with the metabolic hubs. I understand that you're gathering some insights from immunometabolism and these metabolic hubs. What does that mean? And how are you leveraging these insights to help patients suffering from autoimmune diseases?
Sure, great question. And immunology is really complicated, and so let me do my best. So I think the easiest way to start is to kind of take a step back and think about what the immune system does. So when a normally functioning immune system responds to a infection or a bacteria or a virus that comes in, it needs to turn on incredibly fast. It needs to sort of gear up and respond to a bacterium that might be dividing every 20 minutes and just uses an enormous amount of energy to kind of mobilize its resources to fight off this response. And then once that threat has been neutralized, the immune system has to very actively turn itself off, or else the body becomes completely overwhelmed with that inflammatory response. And so both of those processes, kind of turning on and then actively turning off, use an enormous amount of energy. It's one of the most energy demanding systems in the body. And that's what metabolism is. Metabolism is basically how either your body or your cells use energy, use nutrients to drive their expansion and then shutting things off. And so what we do at Rios is we study the metabolism of these cells, the kind of inner workings of immune cells, both in patients and in healthy subjects, normal subjects, and look to see what is it in their metabolism, in their chemistry, that is causing that system to turn on inappropriately, or is causing that system to not turn off appropriately. So we consider those sort of basic metabolic hubs, the kind of turning things on and then turning things off. And so so it's very complicated science and kind of these multi-omic analyses looking at all sorts of different stuff. But the goal is basically twofold. One is to find new drug targets. And by a target, I mean something like TNF or JAK, something that is a kind of part of the immune system that you can go in and develop a drug to go after. So we look for those new targets. That's a big piece of what we do. We have a collaboration with Roche around this, identifying novel drug targets to move forward. And then the other piece of what we do is to use that insight we get from looking at what's going on inside of cells to understand the differences from one patient to another, the differences between a patient and a normally functioning immune system, so that you can go in and develop what we call precision medicine. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit next.
Yeah, look at you. Perfect segue. And you know, this whole immunometabolism is a really exciting space. It's something we haven't seen in the autoimmune world. You know, just for all of those folks who are listening in, you know, we haven't seen a whole lot done in the immunometabolism space when it comes to treatments. And so what's really is exciting is that this is like an entirely new mechanism of action and potential treatment for maybe those who have not done so well on the existing treatments. So, all right, precision medicine. We hear this term a lot in cancer, and there have been some really amazing drugs that have come to market that are geared towards this precision medicine concept. We haven't heard a lot about it in autoimmunity. Can you talk more about what exactly precision medicine is to start, and then how you're working to apply it to your treatment?
Sure. So oncology is the best place to start. So if you know someone who's had breast cancer, you know, they'll go in and test to see whether it's estrogen receptor positive or not, because the drugs that you're going to use in those patients, if it's an estrogen receptor positive or negative breast cancer, are going to be different. So you have a level of precision in which drugs you're going to bring to bear. The reason we don't talk about it in autoimmunity is because we don't have any drugs that work, that we don't have anything that you can apply in that way. But the need for it, I think, is viscerally obvious to every patient. And that is that we don't have any drugs that work in everybody. And there is really no way to find out which drug is going to work in you until you try it. And so you end up with step therapies and treat to failure. And, you know, it's not even easy to find out whether a drug is working until you have a clinical readout. So you may have to be on something for 3, 4, 5, 6 months before you even know if it's working. And then the best of these drugs tend to work in 20 to 30% of patients. So anti-TNFs, for instance, which have been pretty remarkable for those patients that work, only work in generally, you know, less than 30% of patients will have a long-term durable response to them. And so what we're trying to do, the dream for autoimmunity, and we're not the only ones working on this, is to be able to identify for a given patient what the abnormalities in the immune system are, what's the drug that's going to be able to treat the disease in that patient, and be able to predict whether you're going to respond, and not just do it by this kind of long-term trial and error. And ultimately, the goal is to have drugs for every patient. So whether it's, right now it's, you have to kind of go through and try them, but you'd like, and some patients never get the right drug, but you'd ultimately like to have a whole arsenal of tools that you can use, and have the diagnostic ability to predict which drug is going to be used effective for which patient. And this is important. I mean, it's primarily important when you get into the, when you're on the market, and when you have drugs that are really bringing the most benefit to patients. But I think one of the things that people may not appreciate is how challenging autoimmunity is to work in from a drug development perspective, because of that patient heterogeneity. So if you're developing drugs for lupus and the patient population is so heterogeneous, to be able to get a response in a clinical trial, and I know you guys were talking about clinical trials, you have to have a huge number of patients. So it makes it really, really hard to, when you don't know which of those patients are going to respond, you don't know how to run those clinical trials. And it's led to many, many fewer drugs being developed in this space than any of us would like, just because it's hard. So it's important kind of both for getting that whole pipeline of drugs going, and obviously ultimately for patients. So.
Yeah, no, that was a great explanation. And I want to put my own personal spin on it, and just talk a little bit about how essential and unique it is that as part of your platform, you are working to, again, personalize it and try to figure out what target is going to be best for the patient. And I know that a lot of folks in the audience can appreciate what I'm about to share that I've been through personally, right? So I have been on a series of biologics, and the medicine failed me. The first anti-TNF inhibitors were not a fit for me. Had I had a diagnostic test that could have told me those were not going to work, I could have gotten to the treatment that worked faster. Exactly. And that's the beauty of what you're developing, is that you're working that into, you're building that into the development of your drug. And so that is really exciting.
Yeah, because as you know, it's not just that you had to suffer for an extra 6 months without being treated. That untreated disease can cause permanent damage, and you can end up with, I mean, depending on the disease, fibrosis, it becomes harder and harder to treat. So you'd really like to be able to get to the drug that will work as fast as you can. So
yeah. And so now I want to talk a little bit about the future here. Yesterday, as you mentioned, we did have attendees who attended a series of breakout sessions where they were learning more about clinical trials and the drug development process. We know it's unfortunately longer than most of us would like it to be. And so can you tell us where you are in the drug development process as it stands?
Yeah, we are a very early stage company. So our lead compound, actually, we just put out a press release last week. Our lead program is just going into human subjects next year. But even that is going to be healthy volunteers. You're just looking for that initial safety. You're looking for that initial, does it do what you expected it to do, just from a chemistry perspective? And so we won't be in patients with that drug for a couple of years. And then, as you know, it's a long haul after that. There are all sorts of innovations in clinical trial design that have kind of come through in oncology, again, to make things faster, basket trials, things to kind of get a faster read so that you can kind of shut those timelines down. And we're very interested in exploring some of those to be able to get some of this to patients sooner. But most of our drugs are still working in mice, and it's a lot easier to cure mice than it is to cure people. I will tell you that.
But that's okay. That's where it starts. And our hope is that you're able to really race through this process, and definitely encourage folks to keep an eye on Rios and what's happening, and maybe at some point you can enroll in one of their clinical trials once they begin enrolling.
And I also just, you and I have talked about this before, but even though we are so early, it is so helpful for us to be talking to patients because the end point, the side effects of drugs that may not be front of mind to us as we're going through it. The fact that a drug may make you fatigued, or just the things that are not going to be top of mind to us, but will dramatically affect whether it's going to be useful to you. It's so important for us to hear that very early on in the process, so we know what to be looking for, and how to be thinking about what's going to actually make a difference in patients' lives. So.
Yes, Dr. Fox, that's my favorite thing to hear. We love to bring the patient voice in.
Yeah, and it's great for our employees too. I mean, it's just so motivating to hear about the people who are going to ultimately benefit. So.
Yeah, I love it. Well, all right. So our time is close, and I want to end with your personal hope for the future of autoimmune treatment.
Yeah, I mean, I could say that, I mean, obviously what you really hope is that you're going to have drugs that will be truly curative, or preventative measures that will prevent this from happening. I think that's a long ways off. And so I think the thing that I most want is just a bigger range of options of, having what you have for other diseases, where you find something that works and maybe something happens in your immune system, it stops working, but there are like 8 other things that you can turn to. So just getting more tools, more options available for patients, better insight into what's going to work where, so that we can deal with these just extraordinarily complicated diseases in a meaningful way.
Beautifully said.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. And thank you for bringing empathy and brilliance to the autoimmune space. It's what we need. Thank you for innovating on our behalf. It was a pleasure to have you here today, and look forward to watching Rios continue to thrive and grow in the future.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
And so Dr. Fox really gave us a great transition here, because as she was talking about more options, that's exactly what we're going to do next. We're going to talk to Dr. David Chernoff he is the Chief Medical Officer of Setpoint Medical, and they've got some really exciting innovation happening at the company. And for those of you who attended the rheumatology breakout yesterday, you may have heard from Kelly Owens, who shared her personal experience in a clinical trial. That clinical trial happens to be Setpoint Medical's. So we're connecting the dots between the summit. Dr. Chernoff, welcome. Thank you for being here. I'd love to have you take a moment to introduce yourself before we jump in.
Yeah, Lily, thanks very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel, also to be on a panel with Dr. Fox. Listening to her, it's a hard act to follow. But yeah, so I'm from the East Coast originally. I grew up in a medical family, and 4 of my 6 siblings are physicians, so it's a kind of a family affair. But what influenced me ultimately to do what I'm doing now was, when I was at NYU as a medical student, I was working in a rheumatology lab. I was very interested in how cells and inflammation are controlled. And that was at a time when we didn't have anti-TNFs. We weren't using methotrexate. We'd go on rounds and we gave rheumatoid patients really high doses of aspirin, like 16 aspirin a day. And it was very toxic. And at the same time, it was just at the dawn of the AIDS epidemic. So we saw that this virus, which we didn't understand at the time, resulted in severe immunosuppression, and many of these young men were dying of fatal infections. And then I moved to San Francisco to do my internship and residency with the intent on being a rheumatology fellow, which I was. But all we saw at the time was AIDS. It was an explosion before therapies were available. So my rheumatology clinic were autoimmune patients who were infected with HIV. And it was this very challenging to manage them, to try to manage both diseases simultaneously. And those 2 sort of intersections of events really influenced my career. And when I left UCSF after being a full professor, I went to Chiron which developed a lot of the molecular diagnostic tools that we use to look at the blood supply to detect viruses like HIV and hepatitis, and also how to measure the virus so that we could do clinical trials. And we did a lot of work on the new drugs that were being developed at that time. And so it was really dissatisfaction with the system that led me to go into industry. And if we skip forward some time, the last company that I was involved with and started was Crescendo Bioscience. And the reason we did that, I was very disturbed by the fact that rheumatology patients were being followed and monitored for their inflammation with tests like CRP and ESR. These are tests from 100 years ago. And most patients with active rheumatoid or active lupus had normal blood tests, so they weren't being useful. And we couldn't decide what drugs to use. As Dr. Fox clearly pointed out, it was just try one, try another, and they're very expensive. They cause infections. So we developed kind of a multi-omic panel called Vectra that measures lots of different proteins, trying to get a better inflammation thermometer. And we commercialized that, and that's been successfully used by many clinicians over the years. But it was really a dissatisfaction with what the tools that we were using, which were ancient compared to the rest of the field. So what led me to Setpoint was, as I mentioned before, this intersection between infections and trying to reduce inflammation. You have to have a very careful balance. As anyone who's been on these drugs know, you have to be screened for tuberculosis. People get recurrent infections like sinus infections, et cetera. So it's very difficult to get that balance right. And what Setpoint was doing at the time was trying to take a different approach to treating inflammation, not by neutralizing things that are too high a level in autoimmune patients, but also required to keep you from getting serious infections, but to use the body's own natural way of controlling inflammation. And this is really interesting work that's been done by Dr. Kevin Tracy, who's a neurosurgeon who works at the Feinstein Institute. And what Dr. Tracy found was that our whole concept of how inflammation is controlled was missing several important pieces. And what he found was that the brain itself has a powerful role in controlling inflammation. And the way it does it is that it can listen to the immune system. It can listen to your organs. And the way it listens for danger signals is it uses the vagus nerve to be its sentry, or you can think of it like thousands of Nest cameras in your body, if you want to use that analogy, because the vagus nerve is the longest of the cranial nerves, and it has touch points with almost every organ in your body. So when there is inflammation, it can pick up those signals and relay it to the brain almost instantaneously. It can pick up TNF, IL-6 signals, and then the brain thinks about it for a few seconds and says, okay, how are we going to control the inflammation so that it doesn't get out of hand, but at the same time, reduce it to a point where we can control it, but not reduce it too much where you would have problems with infections. And it's able to do that using the vagus nerve again. It's sort of a two-way highway. It sends signals back through the vagus to the spleen, and there's a whole series of steps that occur very, very rapidly within minutes that reduces the amount of inflammation that comes from these inflammatory cells by maybe 50 or 60%. So it's not as suppressive as a drug like a Humira-like drug, but it does modulate those cells, and it reduces inflammation. And I think we have a slide. Yeah, so here, let me just take you through this, because this is really foundational to the work we're doing. We believe that drugs are effective, but as Dr. Fox mentioned, many of them don't work. So here is the brain listening for inflammation on the left, and it hears inflammation, and it wants to perform what we call like a rheostat, like dialing the light up and down with a dial. So it sends signals through the vagus in red, and the vagus nerve then speaks to the splenic nerve at this celiac plexus. They're not actually connected to each other, so it speaks to the splenic nerve by secreting acetylcholine. And this is the really foundational issue, that we always consider these neurotransmitters, but these same chemicals influence the behavior of immune cells. And the way that works is that the vagus secretes a chemical called acetylcholine, a very well-known neurotransmitter. It tells the splenic nerve to educate cells in the spleen, and the splenic nerve then educates those cells by secreting another neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. And that norepinephrine, those little green dots, then activates T cells in the spleen. You can see this is a whole series of communications. And those T cells secrete acetylcholine. It uses a neurotransmitter to influence the behavior of the green macrophage. And the macrophage is one of the important inflammatory cells that releases things like TNF, IL-6, IL-1. These cytokines are hyper-regular or very excessively upregulated in many diseases, so we use antibodies to block them. But when you do that, you also increase risk of infection. So what we're doing is telling the macrophage to not overdo it with respect to the secretion of these cytokines. And so what we can do is we can augment this system in people with autoimmune disease, or supercharge it by taking a little device that we've developed and actually activating this with electrical energy. And this is fundamentally a completely different way of treating autoimmune disease compared to drugs.
It is, and this is just so exciting, this bioelectronic medicine. And I thank you so much for walking us through that. I would love for you to tell me a little bit more about Setpoint Medical's device and how exactly it works.
Yeah. So for the last 25 years, people in the epilepsy field have been implanting devices that are used to control epilepsy. So the idea of using something to stimulate the vagus and the surgery is quite established. But that was a very bulky device. And so we wanted, with a big battery and leads, we wanted to develop a much more sophisticated device. And I think we may have a picture of what that looks like on the next slide. Because of advances in electronics and so on, we were able to develop this device. You see on the left-hand panel that we call it a micro regulator, but it's an integrated ceramic titanium implant that's about the size of a penny compared to a very large battery that used to be in what they implant for epilepsy. And this device is implanted in the patient in an outpatient procedure that takes about 45 minutes. The patient goes home afterwards. And what we do in panel B, the vagus nerve we show here is sort of like a piece of white spaghetti. We put a little positioning pod that's made out of silicon, very soft, non-reactive pod, and we simply place the microregulator inside that little, translucent taco, and we sew it with a suture closed, and we close the wound. And a couple of weeks later, the patient comes in for the device to be activated. And the way that we work with this device, the way that we communicate with it, is through an iPad, a special iPad app, because you can do everything on an iPad now. And we can program the device to deliver a certain amount of electronic treatment. It's almost like an electronic prescription pad, and that's what we call it, to program the device. And the way that we keep this thing charged is that about once a week in panel D, you put this nice necklace on that has a magnetic clasp, and it just sits there for about 15 minutes, and it remotely charges the device. So there's no direct connection, like an iPhone. And this way, the device can be programmed to deliver a therapeutic dose of electricity that stimulates the vagus, that then goes through the process I showed before. And this is the device that we're testing in our trials in the US now.
Yeah, no, it's so exciting because it's unlike anything we've really ever seen before in treatment or for in treatment for autoimmune disease. And so that, and you just brought this up, it brings me to my next question. Could you talk a little bit more about the studies that you've run? I understand you've run a number of studies, so we'd love to hear the outcomes.
Yeah, so we, prior to doing this, we ran all the traditional animal models like arthritis in rodents or inflammatory bowel disease. It didn't work just like a drug, but the key issue is, will it work in people? And the answer is what we've seen so far, that it seems to. And so what we've done is 3 clinical trials to date. Some of them have been in Europe and one in the United States. But in the European trial that came from the Netherlands, which was published a few years ago, we looked at vagus nerve stimulation in people who had just taken methotrexate and who hadn't responded well, and in patients who had taken multiple biologics who had failed those drugs. There were no JAK inhibitors available at the time. And in an open label study that was done using the epilepsy device, which we reprogrammed, because at the time we had completely developed the microregulator I showed you in the previous slide. And in those studies that were led at the time by Professor Paul Peter Tack, we found profound reductions in disease activity in these patients who had failed these different drugs. And when they turned the devices off, the disease started to come back. And they turned the devices back on and the disease went back down. And we have some patients who are 5+ years out or more who continue to be in low disease activity just using this device. So that was an interesting proof of concept. We also are able to tell whether or not this is working by some special blood tests. But we've conducted a pilot study in the US in the last 2 years using the device I showed you, the small miniaturized device. And we found in patients with RA who had failed almost everything, biologics, methotrexate, JAK inhibitors, that in half of the patients who had failed essentially everything, we were able to get significant declines in disease activity, similar to what drugs might do. And we've also done a trial in Crohn's disease in Europe, in TNF refractory Crohn's. And we've also seen clinical improvements, both from the patient's perspective, from the perspective of biomarkers, and also from the perspective of how the endoscopic biopsies look. So you have this thing called mucosal healing, where you take a biopsy of the intestine and you see how much inflammation. We saw healing of the inflammation. So from these studies, we're very excited. And we also have some preclinical work in MS that this neuromodulation and using the vagus to dampen inflammation may be applicable to multiple autoimmune disease. And that's a very exciting finding.
It is a brilliant finding, and I'd love to hear more. I've got a question from the audience, but I'd also like to hear a little bit more about where you're at in the treatment development process.
Yeah, so right now we're conducting in the United States only our pivotal trial of vagus nerve stimulation, and we call that the RESET RA study, and we may have a slide on that. But so the RESET RA study. And so this is on clinicaltrials.gov if you're interested in more of the details. And what we're doing with the permission of the FDA is implanting rheumatoid arthritis patients who continue to have signs and symptoms of active disease despite being on multiple medications with our implant. And we either turn the device on or don't turn the device on for the first 12 weeks. And we evaluate how the patients respond, both clinically, both from a biomarker perspective. And we also look at the joints in the hand and wrist using magnetic resonance imaging technology to see how the erosions look, how the inflammation in the bone look. And so we've initiated that in the United States. We're going to continue to do that. We plan to enroll up to 250 patients as we go through this process.
Yeah, and you answered Nina's question. She asked, how do we participate in these clinical trials? And so actually this QR code for folks who have their smartphone, you can pull that out and you can scan it, or you can type in resetra.study. And Dr. Chernoff, do you see yourself kind of going into some additional studies or different indications in the next couple of years?
Yeah, so good question. So, as a venture-backed private company, we are not a big pharmaceutical company. If we were a big pharmaceutical company, we would do multiple trials and multiple indications at the same time. But I think we have to prove that we can successfully treat rheumatoid arthritis. If we are successful, and I'm very confident that we will be, then the sky's the limit in terms of doing trials in inflammatory bowel disease. We're very excited about the preclinical work in multiple sclerosis, because remember, for all of these autoimmune diseases, MS, IBD, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, psoriatic arthritis, etc., there's a fine balance between suppressing your immune system so that your psoriasis and your Crohn's goes away, and not killing the person with infections, and that is the constant battle that is very difficult to figure out where is the right set point, and that's why our company is called Setpoint. Where is the set point where you balance those two opposing forces? And there's some really interesting work ongoing at Harvard in Dr. Sirhan's lab, who was in the same lab with me at NYU, where he's shown that the vagus nerve and stimulation of the vagus nerve actually improves the ability of white blood cells like neutrophils to kill and clear bacteria. And if that's the case, it may be that vagus nerve stimulation actually reduces your pathologic inflammation related to, let's say, your Crohn's, but it improves your ability to fight infections. And if that really is the case, that would be a big advance. And this therapy is not meant to replace conventional therapy. It's meant to be an alternative to conventional therapy when that doesn't work, or being combined with conventional therapy. So it's activating your own immune process and your own inflammation cascade control pathways by using electricity.
I am jazzed about this, Dr. Chernoff. I think this is exciting for the future of autoimmune treatment. And I encourage those who didn't get the chance to attend the rheumatology breakout session yesterday to, we will be putting up recordings from all the sessions to check that out and hear Kelly Owen's story participating in the Setpoint clinical trial. And Dr. Chernoff, thank you so much for joining us today, and Dr. Fox as well. This was just such a pathway to the future of what autoimmune treatment could look like. So thank you both for your time, for your energy, for your dedication and innovation that you are bringing to this space on behalf of autoimmune patients. I can't think of a better way to close out the summit. Thank you, everybody.